My very first story that I want to share with you guys is something very special. The AMA actually holds a very special place for me in my career. And frankly, I hadn't thought about it in a long time, but when this opportunity came up to speak, and they said, tell a little bit about yourself and how you got started. I was in graduate school in 1981, and I had paid for my undergraduate myself. I'd paid for my graduate school. And I was pretty much at the point that if I didn't get a job like the day after graduate school, I was going to be eating cheese crackers like I did between undergraduate and graduate school. So I was very motivated. So everybody, says, what should you do? So I called up the AMA in Atlanta, and I think I got through to Ken Bernhardt, who I think was the president at the time. And so Ken was wonderful, and you all know Ken. He's a legend, and he and I have done many things together in this community since then. But Ken said, you should talk with Diane Lanier, who actually happens to be sitting at this table. Diane, you got to raise your hand before I tell this story. He said, you should talk with Diane Lanier about what the possibilities are out there. So I called Diane, and the first thing that I was very happy about is Diane had a Southern accent. And here's the deal. I'm from a small town. I've got a Southern accent, and I thought, wow, when I come to Atlanta for a job, everybody's going to be so sophisticated. There are going to be no Southerners there, and I'm going to feel really out of place. I really was intimidated a little bit. But Diane was so kind and warm, and so she said, look, there's this job at Arby's, and it was a job for being a sales analyst. So I was like, this is great, because when you get a graduate degree, all it is crunching numbers anyway. So I'm like, I can do sales analysis, I know I can do this. So I go to get ready for the interview, and I just mentioned off the cuff to Diane that I didn't even have a briefcase. She goes, come to my house, I've got a briefcase for you, and blah, blah, blah. So the rest is history. I took someone else's briefcase to the interview. I met with a guy named Larry Kruger, who was this old kind of crotchety ad guy who was running Arby's marketing at the time. And he was just kind of, like this. But he goes, you know why I want to hire you? And I go, no. And he goes, because you're an English major, and I need people who can write. And, Diane had given me all these great things to say and everything. So I said them. I got the job. And so thank you, Diane, and thank you, AMA. So let's go for you. And Diane has actually said that I've now shamed her into joining AMA again. And she was president of AMA back in our early days. So anyway, all that to say that I did start my career out at Arby's. Arby's was my first job out of graduate school. I've been at Arby's 3 times. And I think I may be the only person who's been at Arby's 3 times. And as I go through my presentation, you'll probably understand why. But I mentioned a little bit of chronology here. I was at Church's, as Joanne mentioned, for 12 years. I went there as VP of Marketing and was fortunate to move into the president's role after a couple of years. And as Joanne mentioned, I was the first female president of an international fast food chain. And so that was kind of the thing that got a few headlines back then, because we're talking in the 90s, and that may seem weird to some of you in the audience, but there was a difference in the 90s and kind of how women are viewed in the workplace now. But the biggest deal wasn't so much that I was a woman at the end of the day. It was really one of the first times that a marketing person had been allowed, frankly, to be at the top of the organization in food service, because it had been very much driven by operations and finance, and I didn't have either of those in my background. So really, and for the franchisees and for people in the industry, that was kind of the news. So it really did kind of all come back to marketing, and I love the Church's brand still to this day. And the next thing I did that I thought you would find of interest in my career was going to Susan G. Komen for the Cure. And it was just such an honor and a privilege to get to do that role. And Komen, you probably know about the races and some of those other things, but Komen is the largest funder of scientific research for breast cancer besides the federal government. And one of the things I'm most proud of is one of the years that I was there, we actually gave $100 million to scientific research for breast cancer. But the reason I bring this up at a marketing meeting is that Komen truly is a marketing juggernaut. And if you really think about it, it really is nothing but a brand. There's no product to sell. There's no service to sell. You're sort of selling hope, but your brand is all you have. So you really have to know how to package that brand and know how to protect that brand. So if you ever want to kind of just study a brand, I'd first of all start with Nancy Brinker, who is the founder of Susan G. Komen for the Cure. It was her sister who died of breast cancer at 32, and she put a stake in the ground at that time to say that she was going to end the disease. And she is a marketing genius, and this is a brand that is worth studying. And again, it was my privilege to be there for 3 years and 3 months. And the reason I say it that way is because it was in Dallas, Texas, not Atlanta, Georgia, and I love Atlanta so much, so I came home. Okay, so looking at the sign, who wouldn't want to be at this brand 3 times? Okay, so I'll skip you the boring middle part, but now I am privileged to be the president of this brand, and I'll tell you about this hat. And you guys in this business understand this. We have 86% nationwide recognition of the hat without the words in it, that people know that it's Arby's, and that's a pretty darn strong logo. So we're pretty proud of this, and that's one of the reasons why. I'll just give you a little bit of context around Arby's. We got about 3,600 restaurants, $3 billion in sales, and 70% of our restaurants are franchised. And what that really means at the end of the day, for those of you who don't come out of franchise business, is that we don't exactly have the, what shall I say, just the ease of being able to kind of, do our strategy, do our homework, and say, this is what we're going to do to drive the brand. When you've got franchisees, they're really your first customers, your first line of defense. And if you can't convince them to do what you need to do for the consumer, then it's never going to happen. So being in a franchise kind of business adds a little bit of a layer of complexity to marketing. You got to market internally a lot before you ever get to see the customer with it. And I see some head nods out there. I think people know what I'm talking about. We're in 48 states. It's really sad for places like, I think it's Vermont and Rhode Island, but they can drive, to New Hampshire, Connecticut, and get some. We're in 4 countries right now, and really, of all the countries, oddly enough, Turkey is where we're growing the fastest. We've got a group who has signed up to build 100 restaurants there, and every time I turn around, they're really building. So that's one of our great stories. 201 DMAs, so we're talking to a lot of people with a lot of different things going on, and over 100,000 employees worldwide. So again, as you guys well know too, you got to sell to this group. A little history on Arby's since I've been there. We were owned by Wendy's Arby's Group, which was a public company, and actually Arby's, which is smaller than Wendy's, bought Wendy's a couple years ago, and I took the job in May 2010, and I think really in about September 2010, the powers that be started thinking about selling the Arby's brand. And so we started that process in earnest in January of 2011 and worked with a lot of different private equity groups. And I don't know who all has been through that process, but it really is a pretty interesting process because you have to really look inside yourself as a brand. You have to know what you are, you have to know what you're selling, and you have to be able to articulate a future to the people who are buying you. And we were fortunate to be purchased by Roark Capital Group, who is right here in Atlanta. And you may have heard of them, but here's kind of the big news. The other reason I say we were fortunate to be purchased by them, they own 19 food brands. And all of these food brands, save 1 or 2, are highly franchised. So they understand the franchising business, they understand the food service business, and they understand branding. And these are just some of the brands that they own. And the other thing is it's, again, wonderful for them to be in Atlanta because we can really be in touch with them and move things forward. So we're happy about that. When I first came to Arby's, Arby's had been through about a 4-year slump, and that's public knowledge because we were a public company then, and really it was exaggerated by the economy. I mean, everybody knows what everybody's been through. in 2008 and 9, certainly. I think it started a little bit early for Arby's, 2007 maybe, and hurt Arby's a little bit worse than maybe your average brand.